Dear all delegates, faculty, welcome to the BOA MOS Summer Focus Symposium. And today is the first day, first show. We start with the refractive session, and here with me we have stalwarts who are panelists and chairing the sessions. Dr. Partha Vishwas sir, our chairman, Scientific Committee AIOS. Dr. Kuresh Maskudi sir, past president of All India Ophthalmic Society. Dr. Nitin Malkan sir from Mumbai. Dr. Gopal Arora sir, the past president of MOS. And I would like to request Dr. Partha sir to give the opening remarks and also to introduce the first speaker. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vardhaman. I thank BOA and MOS from the bottom of my heart to have this scientific session live on this particular day, the 9th of May, 9 o'clock. So what does it mean? The 9th of May is Mother's Day. And today, let's pray to Mother Earth for deliverance from the evil of this pandemic. Let the human race survive this and come up strong. This is a small prayer that we need to do for ourselves, our community. So let us go on to our first speaker, and this session on refractive surgery does open a great vista. In today's life, the first wave, we have crossed, the second wave, we are there. And let us see and let us hear from Tanvi what the groundwork for a refractive surgery case should be in today's time. Is it any different from what we had previously? Tanvi, please.
Thank you, sir. Good morning, everyone. At the outset, I want to thank BOA for giving me this opportunity. We know that a good preoperative workup goes a long way in giving us an acceptable postoperative result. We know refractive surgery can be cornea-based or lens-based. Today, I'm going to discuss the groundwork required for the cornea-based ones. Why is it needed? Now, these 4 steps are all that comprise of my talk today. We must assess the patient's goal for the surgery and his expectations. We have to evaluate his eye and rule out any risk factors for the procedures. So it sounds simple, right? A good starting point is always the history. The patient can give off many red flags all the time. His manners with your staff, his impatience to wait for the tests done, his reaction when told he may need glasses after surgery. Now, these are patients who are best avoided or at least well counseled before surgery. To sum up, I would say that this is your ideal patient, someone who's easygoing, has a positive outlook, he is having a well-adjusted personality, is currently using less than a full correction, and shows a willingness to wear glasses if required post-op. Now, each and every point in this slide is important for different reasons, and it shouldn't be missed. Some of this will help us decide which procedure we may opt for. For example, a wrestler or a patient applying for Army or Navy services, we may change the option from LASIK to PRK. In a dry eye patient, we would prefer SMILE, or if the patient has a tendency for abnormal healing, a SMILE or LASIK may be preferred over PRK. All of these are not absolute contraindications for laser surgery, but it should be avoided if possible. The next most important part of our groundwork is the ocular examination. This will help us in the decision making. It looks a lot, but there is a pattern to this chaos. So we must remember first that our machines work on the numbers we feed in, and the numbers come from our cornea. So the accuracy is high when the corneal tear film is intact or undisturbed. So this is the chronology we follow. We want to assess the dry eye status of the patient right at the start. So a simple way to get that information is the OSDI questionnaire. We take their contact lens history because it tells us a lot. Because if a patient has suppose opted for LASIK because of contact lens intolerance, then you know right away that it may just be a dry eye or some allergy which needs to be treated first and then go for LASIK. The eye is then first tested with the topolizer machine. The aberrometry is done. Then the topography scan is performed. These scans are more precise when done first. After this, the rest of the tests are done, ending with a dilated retinal examination. The impact of contact lens is underestimated, especially in the high myopes who are mostly on contact lenses without a break, and this can cause a dramatic change on their corneal surface. Here is an example of a 31-year-old female who was on contact lenses for 10 years and had just discontinued them for a day. She had a refractive error of -6 with a -6 diopter cylinder and BCV of 612 in her right eye. Now, this case was an eye-opener because we had to wait for 2.5 years for her cornea to become stable. As you can see, the tangential map shows very many irregularities to begin with and then smoothened after 2 years. Similarly, for her corneal thickness profile. So there was a scan done every 6 months to see her stability. And towards the end, her refraction was to the tune of -11 with just a 0.75 cylinder. So it is always better to wait. The cornea gives us a lot of information and its accuracy depends on the quality of the tear film and the epithelium. This is an example to show how dry eye can affect our measurements. This is the topo scan of the same eye showing two separate cylindrical errors as well as different axes just taken few days apart. And to avoid this confusion, it is always a good idea to look back at your raw data to see if there was a dry spot, if there was any missing data point. Because the interesting part to note is that we will still get some readings from the abnormal scans too, even if the quality wasn't good. So when doing a topo guided treatment like Contura, maybe the quality of scan is very important, and that can just change the way the treatment is done. We go to the visual acuity and refraction. A cycloplegic refraction unmasks any latent hyperopia, which may present to us as pseudomyopia due to the accommodation spasm. So it's a good idea to do that. And also a contrast sensitivity check. A good clinical examination is a must. A single drop of fluorescein can give us a lot of information. We must be on the lookout for some of these signs and then treat them before proceeding because they can cause immediate postoperative complications like DLK, infective keratitis, or persistent epithelial defects. In today's time, the dry eye tests have become very important and they need to be checked for every patient. The tests on the right side are kind of impractical in our current scenarios, but the tear biomarkers are something we have to look out for. Now, a normal tear film thickness contributes to around 43 diopters. If the tear film thickness decreases uniformly, the change in the power of the surface is minimal. But if this happens irregularly, like you can see down, then the change can be as high as 1.3 diopters. Now, this is the impact of the tear film. An unstable tear film will give us inconsistent readings. This will affect the refraction. It will cause a higher risk of postoperative dry eye, all of which leads to an unhappy patient. The dry eye test can classify the patient to have mild, moderate, or severe disease. And of late, a lot of importance has been given to the epithelium, and I think rightly so. Let's just see how this profile can change in dry eyes. You see from the left to the right side, these are scans of patients with no dry eye to severe dry eye on the right. There are epithelial irregularities with thickening and thinning in some areas. These changes in the epithelium have been found to be a sensitive tool to assess dry eye in several studies. The importance of epithelium in subclinical keratoconus patients has been studied too. This was a case of a 26-year-old female with low myopia and a Schirmer's of 15 and 10 interested in LASIK. Her topo scans looked normal, although her Bellin-Ambrosio display showed some abnormal elevations. Now, with those decisions or findings in mind, the decision of PRK was made. This is the Placido image of her left eye with the epithelial map on the right. Now, this thinning correlated with the asymmetry on her curvature map. Her surgery was deferred. There have been studies which have shown that subclinical keratoconus first presents as an abnormality in the topography, in the epithelium before the changes show up on topography or even vision. So it is always better to wait and observe for these changes on the topography than to operate. The topography helps us to understand the corneal curvature, its elevations and thickness. The axial map, the four-quadrant map rather, gives us a lot of details about the astigmatism, the corneal thickness, and any abnormal elevations. I'm sure we'll know a lot more about this in the next lecture. I think a point to highlight is it's always a good idea to look at the tangential map than the sagittal, especially in cases of subclinical keratoconus or chronic contact lens wearers. It detects the localized abnormalities much better. Again, we will see this more in detail in the next lecture, the Bellin-Ambrosio scan. All of this gives us a better idea and helps us differentiate a normal thin cornea from one with an early ectatic disease. Aberrometry is a good tool to understand how an individual eye aberration is. Now, they are particularly important when we want to do a topo-guided treatment like maybe Contura or a retreatment. As discussed before, they should be done right at the beginning because these aberrations can change due to accommodation or just an unstable tear film. A good pupillometry gives us an idea if the patient may experience glare or halos at night postoperatively, and this helps us to decide what optical zone we will treat. The specular microscopy is done in patients who may have thick cornea just to rule out pupils, and also in chronic contact lens users because they may show endothelial cell loss over time. Intraocular pressure should be recorded preoperatively just to get a baseline, and post-op, we must remember to put a correction factor. Although we are operating on the cornea, the rest of the parts can cause equal havoc if ignored. So post-op progressive myopia could just simply be a progression of a nuclear sclerosis which was missed preoperatively. Also, a lid pathology not treated before can cause disastrous postoperative complications. Finally, the retina is examined for any peripheral degenerations which can be barraged before laser. So the moral of the story is that the output can only be as good as the input. So look at the raw data carefully, scan the cornea well, and look for any dry eye or treat it before operating patiently. Consider other issues like vitamin deficiencies which may be present in the patient and treat them first. And lastly, talk to the patient, set a realistic goal. And if you do that, I'm sure nothing can stop you from having a good patient. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Tanvi. And can you stop screen share? Yeah. And we move on to the next speaker on understanding corneal topography. This will be a talk based on very basics, only the Placido disc corneal topography.
Good morning, Partha sir. Good morning, Maskati sir. Good morning, Keledar sir. Good morning, Malkan sir. Good morning, everybody. Wonderful, Tanvi.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning, ma'am.
Thank you so much.
Good morning, ma'am.
Good morning, Vardhaman. Hi, Vardhaman.
Hi, ma'am.
Good morning.
You're looking fresh and raring to go.
Thank you. Hi, Vaishali. Hi, Gopal
Hello,
Bhaiya.
ma'am.
Thank you.
Happy Mother's Day, Ragini ji.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Bhaiya. Thank you so much. Thank you so much.
Can we go on?
Yes, sir. Sorry, sir.
Okay. I'm trying to get to slide 1 somehow. Yeah, I think I've got it. Okay, so I don't think I'm on slide 1. Doesn't matter. So corneal topography is not something very new. It was developed in 1984 as a result of marriage between what was then called video cartography and the advent of computers. So there was a computer analysis as well. The applications of corneal topography are not only in refractive surgery, but we are using it mainly for this, for LASIK and others, but also for fitting of contact lenses, orthokeratology, and post-refractive surgery if you want to evaluate the cornea, and of course for various types of research. Now, what are the measurements that are taken? Very, very basic. What are the measurements? Something called height. Now, how do we know what is height? Imagine a contact lens sitting on the patient's cornea, which has got a known curvature, which is spherical, not aspheric like the cornea is, but which has got a known curvature that is called a best fit sphere. So if you imagine that, then anything which is above that, more curved than that, is depicted in red. Anything which is less curved than that is depicted in blue. So it is a comparison between the difference in height from a sphere of known size called the best fit sphere. So this is, for example, this is the best fit sphere that you can see. And if I can show you, so this is the best fit sphere and this is the one. So since the patient's own cornea is below that, this part is depicted in blue. And over here, you can see the best fit sphere starts here. So the patient's own cornea is above that, so it's depicted in red. So this is what you would call a steep corneal appearance. Now we use certain scales, and for these scales we use colors. Now very, very basic. The warmer the colors, the reds, the oranges, the yellow represent the steeper axis, and the cooler the colors, the green, the blue in the rainbow, they represent the flatter axis. Now there are various scales by which we use. Just to give you a theory, nobody uses this absolute or standard scale. That means it is divided in ranges from 9 to 100 diopters in 26 color-coded steps. The problem with this scale is that even in the keratoconus, everything will appear green because it's between, say, 29 and 55. Everything appears almost the same color, shades of green. So you don't get to know much from this absolute scale. That's why we devise what is called an adjustable scale. So these are steps of equal intervals which you can adjust. But you can have a different starting point and ending point. For example, if you choose 28 to 65, the diopters, then you would get the scale which is seen on the left, with a little bit of yellow below and most of it green. But if you further narrowed the scale, saying that I want to see only 37 to 49 diopters, then you would see the beginning of keratoconus, the red in area over here and more of yellows. So it depends on what scale you have and how narrow your scale is. So this is the adjustable scale. Again, choosing only 10 diopters, 33.5 to 44.5. And this is a typical, see the flatness in the center and the warmer colors around. This could be somebody who's had a LASIK done already. So I told you about height, I told you about scales, colors. Now, basically, topography is all about curvature. And as Tanvi correctly said, there are two types of curvature maps. One is called the global, where the measurements are made relative to the visual axis. This is not so useful. It's less accurate in the corneal periphery and for irregular surfaces. So like Tanvi suggested, we prefer to look at the local maps, or also called the tangential or instantaneous maps. Why do we do so? Because here the curvature at each point is calculated with respect to its neighbors. So we don't want to compare India to America. We compare India to Bhutan and India to Pakistan. So the neighbors, there's a small difference between you and your neighbor. It could be a large difference between you and the periphery. So this makes a more accurate measurement. And then there is differential map. So you've done a LASIK or you've done some Intacs or some procedure. So you have the pre and the post, and then you have the differential map between the two, showing how much of a difference you made. So you can see here the differential map, that this is what you've done, a major flattening which you got over here from the previous K-conus which was here. And then for those who don't like to understand colors and things, there is the idiot-proof method in topography which gives you the indices. So there are corneal indices with 3-letter words. The 4-letter words are bad, so 3-letter words which are given to assess corneal health, like the SIPK and the SCP and the PSI, nothing to do with any Sindhi community, the surface asymmetry index and so on. So the computer calculates all these and tells you whether these are abnormal or normal. And if it's abnormal, then you shouldn't be doing a refractive surgery. We won't go into details of all these indices because of lack of time. Corneal asphericity is another thing which is measured. We know that our corneas are not spherical. If you imagine an egg, then you're looking at an egg-shaped cornea where there is peripheral flattening, a mild peripheral flattening. We have what is called a prolate cornea. Prolate means there is peripheral flattening, and there is a while if you imagine a patient who's had an arcade and a radial keratotomy, there is peripheral steepening over there, oblate corneas. So this is a normal cornea. Many of them are round. That means the colors are equally distributed, about quarter of them, and some of them could be oval curvature-wise, and you could have astigmatism, symmetrical bow ties, as you can see over here, in about 1/5 of the patients, and it could be an asymmetrical bow tie, which is also quite common. So these are asymmetrical. These are all normal. And you could get bizarre maps like this in 7% of normal patients. It could be an irregular cornea which you can't really classify. What is meant by with the rule and against the rule as seen in topography? So with the rule is if you have a plus number or just 2.5 at 90, for example, you can see the bow tie will be vertical. So the bow tie, you can see the warmer colors in the middle, which shows that this is plus. So it's 2.5 diopters at 90 degrees. This is a typical with the rule astigmatism. While without the against the rule astigmatism, ATR will be at the same bow tie, but at 180 degrees. So this is against the rule astigmatism, or a minus cylinder at 90. This is asymmetrical astigmatism, steep superiorly, as you can see. Now, there are some artifacts, and we hinted at that. That is very important to repeat the topo if you're in doubt, or if you see that the Myers are not looking proper. So if there's pooling of tears in the lower meniscus, you'll get a focal steepening. You see this focal steepening over here. This is because there is tears over here. This black area is all tears which is there. So it makes it look artificially as if it's steep here. And the trick is, as Tanvi said, is to look at the raw data and see the distortion of the Myers. And this is how a typical keratoconus would look. Thank you so much for your attention. Vardhaman?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. And thank you, Dr. Tanvi, for a wonderful brief about the patient workup and also the corneal topography now. I would like to invite Dr. Vaishali Vasavda, who is a very good friend and a prolific cataract and refractive surgeon. She's going to speak to us about customizing refractive solutions in cataract surgery. What do you, Vaishali?
Thank you so much, BOA. Thank you, Vardhaman. Thank you, Lahane sir, Ragini madam. And it's both a privilege and honor to be presenting after Maskati sir. Such a precise presentation and all the, I mean, I really refresh a lot of my concepts. So it seems like, can you see the slides on screen?
Not yet.
It seems like there is some problem with my sharing screen. Vardhaman, can I request the next presenter to present and I can go next if that's okay with you?
Yeah, sure, no problem. So I think, yeah. So the next in line is me only actually. So I will be giving my talk, but let me just go to my presentation.
Terrible how panelists are made to self-present without introductions.
Dr. Maskati, you can do the honors.
Hi, Dr. Rishi Bhaiya. How are you?
I'm fine, ma'am. How are you?
I'm good. I'm good.
Yeah. I hope it is visible. My screen.
Very well.
Just go to the full screen.
Excellent color choice, Vardhaman.
Right. Thank you, sir. So to begin with, thanks to Dr. Lahane sir and Dr. Ragini ma'am for the kind invite and for this wonderful start to the BOA MOS Summer Symposium. What I've been asked to speak about is one of the procedures in my armamentarium, which is called as the contour vision, whether it's a reality or it's hype. So over the next 7 or 8 minutes, I hope to give some clarity on following points. What is contour vision? How it evolved over time? What are the real world results? What is the current evidence? How to differentiate between the hype and the reality of this procedure? Is it so revolutionary that it is going to replace all the other present procedures, or it is going to find its place in the current armamentarium? So friends, it was in 1990 when Professor Palikaris performed the world's first LASIK surgery, which completely revolutionized the laser refractive surgery world over and became extremely and globally accepted refractive procedure. It had, of course, many advantages over its pre-sedator before the surface ablations, including very accurate results for, especially for high myopia, lack of haze, lack of pain, and more stable outcomes. But the refractive examer lasers of those times were broadbeam. So especially for higher corrections, there was induction of corneal higher order aberrations, especially the spherical aberrations. And in those times, there was a very high incidence of development of nighttime glare, halos, starburst, and reduced contrast sensitivity because of that induction of higher order aberrations. So now there was a two-pronged approach as we move forward. The first one was how to minimize the induction of higher order aberrations with this laser. So this was done with a new platform called as a wavefront optimized platform. This wavefront optimized platform, as we can see here, has more pulses which are fired in the periphery. Therefore, the prolateness of the cornea is maintained in much better way. And this maintains the corneal aberrations and does not induce much. The second thing which was done to basically safeguard the corneal aberrations was also to create the flaps with the femtosecond laser. Femtosecond laser flaps, as we know, don't induce much corneal aberrations because they are planar flaps. Now coming to the second part, when we have maintained the corneal aberrations, now the next thing was, can we reduce pre-existing corneal aberrations? So this was first attempted with the wavefront guided treatment. As we know, the wavefront guided treatment analyzes the total wavefront of the eye. And with the help of customized laser ablation, we are able to treat not only the refractive errors, but also any aberrations of the entire eye. However, there were certain drawbacks of this technology. The maps were not consistent, basically because, as we all know, the wavefront depends and varies a lot according to the pupillary size, age of the patient, internal astigmatism, especially the lens opacity. So what was seen was that majority of these aberrations are actually coming from the cornea. And the second advantage that was seen was that when you use a topography as a guided tool, the topography is more stable, it is more reproducible, more repeatable as compared to the wavefront, and it also does not get influenced by variables such as pupillary size, age of the patient, internal aberrations such as lens opacities. So the first such tool was used in the form of TCAT, and it was introduced in 2003. And in those times, it was first brought in to correct the pre-existing high aberrations such as central islands, small optical zones, irregular astigmatisms, either primarily because of keratoconus or after post-LASIK ectasia. So when these things were going on, there were a lot of publications which actually demonstrated that TCAT was able to improve the visual acuity of this patient and regularizing the anterior refractive surface. So I think this story of genesis of Contura is very, very interesting because when Alcon is the one who holds the patent for Contura, when they wanted to FDA approve the TCAT software for high irregular astigmatism, they approached FDA. And FDA told Alcon that we would first want to ascertain the safety of the TCAT platform, not on highly aberrated eyes, but on normal virgin eyes. And once you show that this is safe for such eyes, then only we will go ahead and we will do the next study for the highly aberrated eyes. So Alcon with its team did a study called as a TCAT study, which was done in about 9 sites all over the US, including one of my parent institutes, Bascom Palomar Institute. And about 249 eyes were included in the study with a myopia up to -9 and astigmatism up to -6 diopters, in which a topography guided treatment was performed on virgin primary eyes. So what exactly is done in this? So you have a topolyzer, which is basically the topography that we have excellently understood from Dr. Maskati sir. So you have to get reproducible and repeatable maps, ideally at least 4, but up to 8. And then this is fed to the TCAT software. This TCAT software is going to give you all the information about the higher order aberrations at the corneal level. Then it is fed to the EX500 laser. And the EX500 laser is going to create a pattern of the ablation, which involves your manifest refraction as well as correction of higher order aberrations onto the cornea. This is how the ablation pattern would look. So for example, if you're looking at a spherical patient who requires a spherical ablation, this is how the ablation will look like in the first picture. When you actually incorporate the data of higher order aberrations of the cornea, this is how the ablation map will look. And when you combine both of them, this is the treatment plan, which is called as a final treatment plan. It is very important for the TCAT to work well and reproducibly that the manifest refraction treatment plan and the final treatment plan should closely match with each other, and then only you will get much more and better results. So when this study was done by FDA, they were actually quite surprised, and all the investigations were surprised that the results were so good. More than 90% people actually gained 20/20 or better vision. More than 30% people got 20/12 or better vision. But what was remarkable was almost 1/3 of these patients, 31% people, have 1 or more line of improvement of uncorrected visual acuity beyond the pre-operative best corrected visual acuity. Not only the quantity of vision, but also the quality of vision had showed improvement. There was a statistically significant drop in glare, halos, nighttime visual difficulties of these patients compared to the pre-op. And this was the birth of Contura vision. So when this was realized that this works well for first-time users, such as in virgin eyes, then this was reintroduced as the TCAT software for virgin eyes. And now this is what is called as Contura. So what is Contura is it treats the major corneal higher order aberrations of the cornea along with refractive error. It does not induce the spherical aberrations, but it also, because it also maintains the wavefront optimized platform and also has something called as a C4 C12 compensation that we have to actively do. The centration of Contura is corneal on the corneal apex, which is more physiological because you negate the possibility of angle kappa issues. And also it basically has a pupil centroid shift compensation. When we started to perform Contura, which is about 3 or 4 years now, we were actually very happy because in the beginning, we selected patients according to the inclusion criteria of FDM. And we also saw that about 28 or 29% eyes had improved on 1 or more line of UDVA over the preoperative CDVA. But as we expanded our scope of inclusion of all the normal patients, then we realized that actually the results of Contura not necessarily were significantly better than the wavefront optimized platform we were already using. And this was also shown by multiple publications also in India by Dr. Ramurthy as well as by Dr. Rohit Shetty, where they have done randomized study of Contura in one eye and the different optimized in the other eye in normal patients. And they have shown that the results were almost similar. This was also seen in some of the international patients and studies in which the FDA outcomes could not be replicated in other studies. So why the difference? The difference was because FDA study carefully had selected patients which were having excellent marriage or correlation between the manifest cylinder of the patient and the topographic cylinder of the patient. So in which the cylindrical difference in terms of its magnitude is not more than 0.75 diameters, and the axis between the manifest refraction as well as the topography is not more than 5 or 10 degrees of difference. But in reality, only 10 or 20% patients actually meet the FDA criteria. So this is why, as you can see, this is the red, which is what is called as a manifest contura, which is on to the axis of manifest refraction. However, in many patients, it was seen that the topography actually shows an angle which is quite different. Therefore, a new concept in contura was introduced by chromatologists, and this was called as the TMR contura, which is called as a topography modified refraction contour, in which what he suggested was you actually fit in the spherical equivalent from the refraction, manifest refraction of the patient, but you actually take the topographic data for astigmatism correction of the patient. Although Chronopolis demonstrated in his study that the results were mildly improved over the Wavefront optimized platform, but they still did not match the FDA outcomes. Therefore, the introduction of a new concept in contura was done, which is called as a hybrid contura. So what is a hybrid contura is basically when you look at the TMR contura, you are only taking into account the topography, which is the anterior corneal astigmatism. But in reality, the corneal aberrations, they come from anterior cornea, posterior cornea, the lens, as well as the vitreous theory, and also the retinal structures. So in hybrid correction, all these factors are taken into account, not only the corneal topography. And one of the examples of hybrid are ray tracing techniques and what is called as foresights. So the foresights is currently the best form of contura, which is now compared with the traditional manifest contura. When you take into account all these factors together, it was shown by this study by Vabanov et al. That the outcomes were almost matched with the FDA results. That means compared to the different optimized platforms, the outcomes would be now much more better in all the patients. Now, what about the other platforms? Apart from Alcon, the Zeiss, Nightingale, Squint also has topometric treatments, and how are the outcomes with them? All the other platforms also do have topometric treatments, and the outcomes are fairly similar to what you would see with Contura. So what is my current indication of introducing this technology in my clinic is basically I use the Contura system for people who have consistent myopic astigmatism in which there is a good correlation between manifest cylinders and the topographic cylinders. For sure, for hyperopics, this is the best technology on earth because you are actually treating them on the corneal vertex. So the angle contact issues don't happen. And of course, I use it for almost all my keratoconic patients to improve on the irregularities along with cross-linking. However, for all my patients who have a very regular cornea, mainly spherical errors, SMILE is still my best choice. We have to also know that contura still requires a flap, so there can be flap-associated complications, and the dry eye is also an evident thing which can happen. So to conclude on the factors that we discussed on the first slide, is it a revolutionary procedure which will replace all others? Probably not, but it is definitely a great addition to the armamentarium, especially if you have a patient with myopic astigmatisms and patients with hyperopia. For patients who are run-of-the-mill patients with normal spherical errors, even if you choose your different optimized technologies such as surface ablation, femtolasic, or SMILE, will give you equally good results. Thank you very much for your kind attention. Thank you. So I'll just stop sharing my slide. Vaishali, I hope your thing is sorted. Yes.
Yeah.
Right.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Am I audible?
Yes, Vaishali.
Okay. And I'm sorry for that lag, and I won't waste more time. I have no financial interest. But a little offbeat from the refractive corneal surgery that we are discussing. Well, we cataract surgeons have always tried to be at least a little bit behind the refractive surgeons. And now it's time we all catch up, because now patients think very differently even when they come for a cataract surgery. We all have talked about refractive cataract surgery, but I think now it's time we talk about enhancing their lifestyle by giving the refractive performance that they want from their surgery. And these are results from a survey that was done by a company, no financial interest, where 400 people on the streets in India were interviewed regarding what they think from cataract surgery. So people above 60 and who have a cataract, their primary concern with surgery was that they do not want to have any vision impairment for any activity, and that they don't want to lose quality of vision as well as their independence. What also came out as a very interesting finding in this random street survey is that majority of patients above 60 wanted that their near activity should improve after cataract surgery. And what we have learned from literature and from our personal experience is that when there's a gap between what the patient wants and what we can provide, that's when the value-added practice addition goes down. So I think when we talk of refractive surgery, refractive cataract surgery, an optimum pre-op evaluation is very important. Like Tanvi and Maskati sir both stressed very beautifully, so I won't dwell on it too much. An unstable ocular surface has many problems, but very important for us, even a regular cataract surgeon, is unreliable biometry. As you can see here, on the left is the screen showing broken Meyers, and on the right, the same patient, same eye after instilling lubricants. So, well, yes, obviously it will affect your refractive corneal surgery by affecting your topography. But what is very simple and we often miss out is that the keratometry readings, even on your any kind of keratometry, Auto-K or your LensStar or your IOL Master, are going to change. And therefore, from the right, the emetropic power from 21, a regular monofocal power, changed to 20. So even the spherical IOL power is going to change if your readings are not well calibrated or not well taken into account. Like Tanvi said, look at the raw data. The other thing that is very, very important in giving good visual and refractive outcomes is doing a routine posterior segment OCT if you have access to it. And subtle things like these epiretinal membranes or tractions, which could be a cause for loss in quality of vision. And especially when you do these so-called higher technologies of LRIs or toric lenses or trifocals or whatever. And I think the most important thing is looking at the type and the degree of corneal astigmatism. I'll move on to 3 quick cases to end my presentation. Here's a 42-year-old lady, high myope, operated for radial keratotomy and has a cataract. Now, these eyes in the past were just done to remove the cataract, and whatever glasses you get is your own fate. But now is not the time. You can see here on her biometry that she has very flat corneas, 31 and 32, 33. So there is an astigmatism, but when you do a topography, the mesopic pupil shows that within the pupil diameter, the black circle, like Maskati sir was showing in the topography, this black circle, the pupil size, becomes very important to look at. And here is her aberrometry and topography put together. So this black circle, which is her 2.9 mm pupil, we pigmented races are blessed because we have smaller pupils. And in this zone, she has a regular astigmatism. So we used the right formulae, the right calculators, and we went ahead with a toric lens, monofocal toric lens, because she had a regular astigmatism in her mesopic pupil size. And this is what she was postoperatively, and to our and the patient's good luck, she's 6 parts plano. So the message in this case is that even when you think of refractive customizing solutions, we have to think a little ahead and do a lot of workup like you do in a LASIK, and then give the right solution for the right patient. And this is the same patient's post-operative aberrometry. The blue astigmatism on the cornea almost completely neutralized at the IOL plane, and the cornea still looks very regular. Another case of a 53-year-old, very young active male, and has been myopic and wants to have good near vision because he's a stockbroker. So he also has astigmatism. So we discussed with him that you could still have a toric lens monofocal and be myopic for your, be left myopic so that you can continue doing your near work. And we targeted an IOL power using the Barrett formula with a target of -2.34. Long story short, with bilateral toric lens implantation, monofocal, and a deliberate target, which we could achieve thanks to the good formulae, he's very happy and can do all his near and computer work unaided. The last thing we all understand, the holy grail of presbyopia correction. And for me, at least, trifocal lenses, whatever the brand, they have really made it's so much easy. There's not so much of patient selection and thinking and counseling. Yes, there is some acceptable level of dysphotopsias, but on the whole, in at least 80 to 90% eligible candidates, it is very, very rewarding. So here you can see, this is with the patient's full consent that I'm showing you her picture. She manages one of the largest crockery brands in India, and she's diabetic, she's young and a very socially active person, has always used astigmatic glasses and does not want to use them, obviously, now that she has cataracts. With her advice, she went for bilateral trifocal toric IOLs. And as you can see here, she's very happy with her vision.
Put on the brightness.
And this is, I just want to show you how we did with the brightness acuity testing, the real life testing of
brightness maybe आपको comfortably दिख रहा है.
Yes.
You know, because these are focus lights, like a headlight simulation.
Yeah. I can HZ.
So this is reading that she's
And
able
are
to
you seeing any
perform
rings
with
around the light?
bat on, brightness acuity tester.
How disabling is it in terms of, if you look at the top
Again,
of the
this is
disabling
with
line,
her
how
consent
disabling
that
is
we
it?
are doing this.
Yeah, if you're going to ask me to drive in this, I can drive in.
You can drive this.
Yes.
All right. All right.
Now this is a very crude version, but just to show the continuous range of near vision that she has across.
प्रतिवर्ष आंखों की परीक्षा को हाथ धोकर डालना चाहिए. पुरानी.
दोबारा पढ़ लेंगे last time, madam?
Yes. आंखों बल्ब मोमबत्ती या धीमे प्रकाश के चारों ओर.
So I think the point here is that everybody can and should raise a bar. Just talk to the patient more and more. And can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can.
Yeah, sorry. So that was all from me. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Vardhaman.
Thank you so much, Vaishali. So now we move on to the next presentation, which is by Dr. Pooja Kamar from Narayan Nethralaya, and she will talk to us about new dimension in imaging of cornea. Very exciting topic.
Thank you, Dr. Quresh, sir, Dr. Vardhaman, BO and MOS for giving me this opportunity. So I'm going to be talking about how we are moving towards the era where we will need newer dimensions when it comes to imaging to just choose our refractive surgery patients. At the outset, I have no financial interest in whatever I'm going to be talking about. So we all know when refractive surgery started, it started with we used to evaluate our patients' topography with a Placido-based topographer. Then came the slit scan topography and the shine plug based topography. So that showed how posterior elevation, bad D and everything is important. And that gave us a lot of relief because that helped us in picking up the right cases for refractive surgery. But however, still we had a dilemma, and we landed up in having dilemmas whether this is actually a true elevation or not, whether your bad D is telling you a correct information or not. Then to supplement it, in the late 2000s came the biomechanics, and then it came the newer indices like the CBI and TBI. So when the biomechanics was supplemented with the shine plug based topographers and other things, it said that, when you use your CBI, TBI values or any biomechanics value, and you have a cutoff for your suspect ectasia, it helps you, the sensitivity and specificity is so strong that it helps you in identifying even the early suspicious cases who are who might be a probable ectasia cases in future, and that it will help you in avoiding doing, even if the topography looks normal but your CBI, TBI are abnormal, then it helps you that we should not do surgery for this patient. So when this indices came in, we were at a lot of relief. So these are your cases which you see, first your scenario one where normal topography and biomechanics are there. These are your 50% cases, you go ahead and do a surgery. Then there are suspicious bad D, normal biomechanics, normal topography but abnormal biomechanics and abnormal TBI. So these are the clear-cut cases where you probably would not do a surgery, or that you should keep them under observation or choose a surgery for them which will not have an impact on the complications like ectasia. But then, we know that this is happening, like this thing. But then there are these two scenarios, there are a lot of patients who come to you with these two scenarios where there is a suspicious, you can see this is a suspicious topography. There is an inferior steepening, but the CBI, TBI, and BAD-D, all your three indices are absolutely normal. What do you do with this case? And here your topography is absolutely normal. You don't see any steepening, inferior steepening, no post elevation, nothing. But here your CBI is abnormal, suspicious biomechanics. What do you do with these cases? And these are the cases which form 25% of your patients walking into your clinic. So are you justified in telling, not doing a refractive surgery for them? Or should you be doing any particular refractive surgery for them? What do you do? How do you solve this dilemma? So what we did was, whenever you're dealing with, whenever you do a refractive surgery, you're changing your stromal structure, which has a lot of collagen in it. So whenever there is a normal eye, the collagen fibers are nicely populated and, they're very uniformly arranged, tightly added to each other. But when you come to keratoconus, the collagen bundles start thinning out and they're very dispersed. They're not very uniformly attached. But how do we study this? Right now, we have confocal microscopy, which helps us in studying deeper layers of your cornea. But that doesn't give you information about the collagen structure, how your collagen structure is, how the orientation is, how densely they are populated, or what it is. They don't give you any information. What do we do? So we have this imaging on collagen where we build a polarization sensitive OCT. What it does is it's a type of OCT, non-invasive. It throws a polarized light on your cornea. The best part is the stroma doesn't take up this polarized light, and we take advantage of it. And that's how you can study the collagen orientation and the structure. And this is how theoretically your collagens are supposed to be in your eye, the left and right eye. And this is what representation you get it. So I'm going to be discussing few cases like this. You just have to remember, the more densely or tighter the collagens are structured, it will be seen in darker blue or violet color. And the less densely populated they are, it will be towards your green, yellow, orange, or red. So whenever there's a normal topography, normal biomechanics, this is how your corneal structure or collagen structure will be. So now let's look at these three cases, your normal topography biomechanics. There is a good orientation of collagen fibers. But whenever there's a suspicious BAD-D, your biomechanics is normal. The important part is here, your biomechanics is normal, but the BAD-D is suspicious. Your curvature is suspicious, but you see here the collagen is still nicely arranged. When your biomechanics starts reducing, when your biomechanics starts getting affected, your collagen structure starts loosening out. There is partial loss of this collagen orientation and how they are placed, and there is a partial loss of this checker arrangement. You can see this green, yellow, and red have started coming towards the periphery, and even the center is not as densely populated as it should be. And same here, if your biomechanics is normal, your collagen orientation is normal. So actually your PSOCT helps in knowing that whether your what the indices are telling you is the truth or not, and whether you should go ahead with a surgery or not. But is it the real picture? What we did was we did some studies where we correlated the PSOCT findings with the molecular findings. I'll just quickly go into this, and with your clinical findings also. We do preserve the lenticules and epithelium which are collected during our surgeries. We don't throw them, and we did gene expression analysis for them. So now let's look at two cases. One case, normal topography, normal biomechanics. Other case, topography is normal, your BAD-D is normal, but your CBI, TBI is suspicious. So what we did was, just to be on the safer side, we did a trans-PRK because the topography was normal. There was not a clear indication of not doing a surgery. And we did, during trans-PRK, we collected the epithelium. Before surgery, this was what their PSOCT was. The patient who had normal topography has normal orientation of collagen, but the patient who had weak biomechanics, if you see the PSOCT is also showing loss of collagen, the orientation is not very good. And these are how the gene expression analysis was. The patient with normal topography had normal levels of LOX and collagen in the cornea as well, telling us, and the patient who had a weak biomechanics, weak collagen on PSOCT, had a weaker collagen in and LOX and the gene expression analysis as well. So this tells us that what we are seeing on PSOCT is giving us the true picture. So whenever you are in doubt about your CBI, TBI, or your BAD-D indices, or your topography, curvature and all, the PSOCT is going to be the next way of imaging where it will tell you how the collagen orientation is, and it definitely like a lot matches your molecular level. So you are at ease and you know that, yes, it is telling you the truth. Just to understand, in keratoconus also, a lot of times we see different biomechanical indices. The same correlates with the PSOCT finding. The keratoconic eyes with like a stronger biomechanics have a better collagen, and as the biomechanics starts dropping, the collagen orientation is also started reducing, and they are very scarcely populated in the cornea. Now let's see these two cases. One patient, similar grades, one like, in fact, the first patient is grade 2. It has not progressed. It is stable at 6 months. But the patient who was in stage 1 kept on observation, progressed over 6 months. So why the patient with the higher grade of keratoconus did not progress, and the patient who had a lower grade of keratoconus, like a grade 1, which with minimal risk of progression, progressed? The answer lied in the collagen structure. The patient who did not progress had a good collagen, like the collagen structure and orientation in the stroma was better compared to that of the patient who progressed. And that's why the collagen which was there in the cornea held the cornea in place and didn't let the slippage of collagen happen, and that's why they were stable and the other one progressed. So this will the PSOCT in future will help us in screening for refractive surgery patients, like those 25% patients whom we are going to refuse surgery. It will help us in identifying the correct ones, whether to do it or not. It helps us in identifying the form thrust cases. It will help us in monitoring KC progression, when to do a cross-linking, when not to do a cross-linking. It also helps, like additional applications are, it helps us in post-graft imaging, like the corneal transplant imaging, what the outcomes are going to be. And it also has applications in a lot of retinal disorders. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Pooja. I think it was a wonderful talk. And now we go on to the next one by Dr. Nitin Nedia, sir. As we all know, he's a prolific refractive surgeon of Ojas Eye Center in Mumbai, and he's going to speak to us about refractive surgery in thin corneas.
Thank you, Vardhaman, and thank you, Dr. Maskati and Dr. Ragini. So my talk for today is on thin corneas.
Good morning, Dr. Nitin bhai.
Good morning. So my talk for today is on thin corneas and how they pose a refractive challenge, because there are so many cases we come across where there is a dilemma what to do, whether we should do a corneal refractive procedure or whether we should do a lens-based procedure. So when we first started LASIK, the initial thoughts were that the LASIK cannot be performed in corneas which were less than 500 microns. And the thickness of the residual stromal bed, if it is less than 250 microns, then it was a primary factor for the development of keratectasia, which still holds true. So what we have realized that a thorough workup is very essential, a routine workup, and along with that, now we also have the Pentacam HR and we have the Corvus ST, which helps us to take the right decision.
Dr. Dedia, sir, excuse me, your screen is not visible. We are not able to see it.
Okay, you can't see the screen?
No, sir. Dr. Maskati, can you see the screen?
Screen is not visible.
Not visible.
Okay, 1 second.
Yeah. Visible now.
Okay. Yeah, so we have the ectasia score, which we also look at. And some of the parameters which are important is the topography pattern, the residual stromal bed thickness, the age of the patient, the corneal thickness, and the mean refractive spherical equivalent. And based on this, we decide, depending upon the score, whether you want to do a refractive procedure like a LASIK or whether you want to do a surface ablation procedure. So based on the scores being less than 2 or up to 2, a score of 3 and a score of 4 points, we decide on the procedure. So we have a lot of treatment options, like we have either you can go in for a LASIK procedure where we can also have other modalities of treatments where we can change the ablation zone, we can change the corneal flap thickness, and we always keep the percentage thickness ablation to within the safe limits. Besides LASIK, we also have the modified PRK, or what we call as the trans PRK now, the sub-Bowman's keratomelusis, the femto-LASIK, the SMILE procedure, and the phakic IOL. So all these are good options for a thin cornea, and wherever you need to change or wherever you feel which one is best for the patient, we would opt for that. Now, if you look at the femtosecond laser flap, it has minimum variability in the central thickness across the different flaps. You have minimum variability regionally within the flap, and it confirms earlier studies performed with regional subtraction pachymetry and histology. So you have a more or less a planar flap, which makes it more safer. And most of the studies on the thin corneas less than 470 microns have shown that femtolaser is very safe as compared to the LASIK procedure due to the microkeratome. So one important parameter which we all need to understand is the percentage thickness ablation, which is the flap thickness along with the ablation depth divided by the central corneal thickness. And if it is more than 40% ablation, then it is associated with significantly greater risk of ectasia. So this is a good parameter which you can look at before deciding on whether you want to do a flap-based procedure or you want to do a surface procedure or you want to do a lens-based procedure. The Pentacam now, besides topography, gives us more additional information by way of the corneal thickness spatial profile. It also gives us a good anterior elevation and the axial map along with the sagittal map and the keratoconus indices. And this makes us more decisive in what procedure to go for. Here again, we have the Bellin Ambrosio software, which gives us a parameter in the form of a green or a yellow or in the red zone. And this makes us alert, and it helps us to once again decide whether the BAD-D is more than 1.6, in which case we would like to refrain from going in for LASIK or a procedure based on the cornea. Similarly, it also helps us in patients where you have very steep corneas, but with a relatively good corneal pachymetry. And here you see again that this curvature map and this back difference is showing that everything looks quite normal. But once again, you have to be careful in these patients. And for these patients, it's very important if you can also judge the biomechanics of the cornea by way of the Corvus ST. So the Corvus ST has now become an important tool, especially in such type of cases. And in cases like thin corneas where the parameters of CBI and TBI, it helps us to make a correct decision. So this procedure, technology of corneal visualization with SignFlux technology has been available since 2011, and it is based on the non-contact air puff tonometer combined with the ultra high speed SignFlux camera. So it deforms the inward and outward corneal curvature while passing through two applanation moments, and it is fixed with a maximum peak pressure for air puff in every examination. So some of the measurements it produces and some of the names you need to understand is the deformation amplitude, the applanation length, and the corneal velocity. The Vincigora screening report gives us a summary of the whole examination, and it is very fast and comprehensive, and it combines the biomechanical information with the pachymetric progression to calculate the Corvus biomechanical index. Here we have certain other understanding of ARTH with corneal deformation parameters, and it's based on 5 dynamic corneal response parameters, which gives us a score from 0 to 1, where 0 is a low ectasia risk and 1 is the high ectasia risk. And the cutoff value for CBI is 0.5. And it is known that it correctly identifies 98% of keratoconic cases among the normal with 100% specificity. Here you can see that this is how the Vinciguerra screening report looks like. And now we also have the TBI, which combines the tomographic as well as the biomechanical data to enhance ectasia detection. And the cutoff here is 0.79 with 100% specificity. And it helps to detect clinical ectasia for eyes with a normal topographic pattern. The cutoff is 0.29 with 90% sensitivity and 96% specificity. This is how the maps look like. Here on one side we have the biomechanical assessment, and on the other side we have the pentacam tomographic assessment, and both are combined to give us the TBI values. The other important parameter also, which is now becoming popular, is the stress strain index, which gives us the elastic property of the cornea. And this helps especially when we are doing the corneal cross-linking before and after a refractive procedure, or even in cases of keratoconus, because we need to understand how effective the C3R procedure is. And here again, we have if it is too soft, then the SSI is less than 1, the curve shifts to the right. And if it is too stiff, the curve shifts to the left with a stress strain index of more than 1. This is how the image looks like of the SSI. And this helps us once again to follow up our patients who have undergone the C3R procedure. The other procedure which also would be considered, which is the LASIK extra, especially in certain cases where you want to combine it with the cross-linking, especially in these thin corneas, where you have a borderline topography between LASIK and PRK, or in cases where you want to do an enhancement in LASIK, or when you get an unexpected thick flap and you are not sure how the cornea is going to behave. So in this, you can do a LASIK extra where you combine the LASIK procedure with the corneal cross-linking in the flap. The RELAX SMILE is again a flapless procedure, small incision, 4 millimeter, where lesser nerves are transected, and here it's more precise. And it's again a single step procedure and is minimally invasive. But here, once again, the Corvus ST has shown, and it has compared the corneal biomechanical stability after the SMILE procedure as compared to the LASIK, femto-LASIK procedure. Although it appears that it is theoretically a stronger cornea post-SMILE, but it is known that this cap cannot contribute significantly to the corneal strength, and therefore there is still some real risk of ectasia in both the procedures. So there is no clinical evidence of a better biomechanical behavior in SMILE procedure versus the femto-LASIK. But last in our armamentarium, we have the phakic IOLs for these thin corneas, where you have even the slightest of the doubt of having a corneal problem with a refractive procedure on the cornea. We can fall back to the phakic lens procedure, which is more cornea saving. It is reversible. It preserves the accommodation, and you can treat even the higher refractive errors where you have a slightest of the doubt, and even more than 8 diopters, and with corneal thicknesses of less than 480 or even 450, where the cornea seems to be unstable. So the decision tree would go if you have a thin cornea with a normal topography, and if it's a high myopia, think of a phakic IOL. If it is a low myopia, you could do a femto-LASIK, SMILE, or a PRK procedure. However, if it's an atypical topography with a high sphere, you can do Intacs with cross-linking, or if it's a low sphere, then you could still do a surface ablation, femto-LASIK, or a SMILE procedure. You could even combine it with a LASIK extra. So in conclusion, careful evaluation of all topography of all the eyes with thin corneas, with use of the Corvus T if it's available and the Pentacam, and an abnormal topography still remains a concern in thin corneas. So Corvus ST has a significant role in demarcating physiologically thin corneas from weak thin corneas. And by taking all possible and acceptable parameters into consideration, if the stromal, residual stromal thickness achieved is more than 300 microns, then one can go ahead with a surface or with a LASIK procedure. And phakic IOL still rests to be an effective alternative for high myopes. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you very much. And I think because of the time, we will directly go on to the next presentation. I would like to invite Dr. Milind Piladar, sir, who has been the past president of March Ophthalmological Society. He is going to speak to us about a peculiar issue which may happen sometimes after LASIK, which is the epithelial lymph growth.
Yeah, may I, thank you very much. May I ask Dr. Nikia? So it starts sharing the screen.
We can't see your screen. Yeah. Yeah, fine.
Thank you very much. And I would like to share my thoughts about LASIK, post-LASIK rare complication. It's a relatively uncommon complication in LASIK. Incidence is very low, 1% in primary cases, whereas 2% in enhancement cases, especially in microkeratome-assisted flap creation. It is less with femtosecond assisted flap creation, and it is usually asymptomatic and may lead to decreased vision due to irregular astigmatism and direct intrusion of cells into visual axis. In my small practice, 5,500 cases done so far, I have come across only 2 cases where it required an intervention. That is, it was crossing the visual axis. So it can be staged into 3 grades. The grade 1 is very thin ingrowth, very limited to peripheral cornea, that is within 1 to 2 millimeters of the flap edge. It requires no treatment. Grade 2 is thicker ingrowth. It has discrete cells evident within the nest, and it is at least more than 2 millimeters from the flap edge. And individual cells are translucent, but can be easily seen on the flap. There is no urgent treatment required, and it can be treated within 2 to 3 weeks. But the stage 3, which is a pronounced ingrowth, a severe cell thickness, it is greater than 2 millimeters from the flap edge, and obvious on a slit lamp, wide geographic areas of necrotic epithelial cells can be seen. Corneal flap margins rolled up and thick whitish gray appearance is seen. It progresses in large areas of flap melting from the collagenase release, which is from the necrotic epithelium. And it gives confluent haze, which is to the peripheral, and the flap pulls away. So it requires urgent treatment, and close follow-up is required for the frequent recurrences. So these are some of the examples which you can see, which are crossing the pupil. Rest of them which are not crossing, they are non-dangerous and can be left alone. So I share my case, which was 23 years male, underwent LASIK uneventfully 1 year back. He complained of pain and gradual diminution of vision, we thought it as corneal infiltrate, and scrape treated as a bacterial infection. There was no response. So we re-evaluated on OCT and thought that it is some case of infiltrate. So we lifted the flap, and as you can see, there are multiple layers of epithelium. You can see that I am lifting up one particular layer with the.
Vardhaman, can you mute everyone and then unmute Milind?
Mr. Sai, can you please mute everybody?
Here you can see the epithelial layer, which is come up. one more epithelial layer sticking to the undersurface of the flap. That also I'm trying to remove. Because unless you remove all the layers, regrowth chances are more. So now you can see that the cornea is relatively clear. I'm removing the tags from periphery also. See, now you can see that the cornea is clear, and you can see a small defect in between from where the scraping was done, thinking that it was a bacterial infection initially. Bandage contact lens was put at the end of the procedure, and pre-treatment visual acuity was 6/18, and post-treatment after about 6 weeks, the visual acuity rise to 6/9 uncorrected. So this was the day 1 post-op. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Very interesting case, and I think you must publish it. It's very unique.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And I think we will move on to next exciting presentation by a very good friend, Dr. Rishi Swaroop from Hyderabad. He is going to talk to us about the reselection of surface ablation, that is PRK or trans PRK. Over to you, Rishi.
Thank you, Vardhaman. And I'd like to take this opportunity to thank BOA and MOS for this wonderful opportunity and much welcome distraction in these troubled times. I hope my screen is visible.
Yes, sir.
I've taken the liberty of slightly modifying the topic. So what I thought was more appropriate, transepithelial surface ablation, which is basically, I feel, a resurrection of the first corneal refractive procedure, which is PRK. And that's what my topic is going to be. So this I had done a few years back, a kind of analysis of the refractive surgeries that I a few months back, analysis of refractive surgeries that I'm doing in my clinic. And as you can see, almost 2/3 of all my refractive procedures are surface ablation. And this is certainly the most predominant procedure in my practice. And I'll try and make a case for this in my subsequent slides. Recently, there was also a survey conducted by the IRSI and Corneal Society of India. And they also found a similar kind of reflection that surface ablation is, of course, the most common procedure performed, but it is increasingly becoming the procedure of choice over other procedures in people who have access to other technologies as well. So what is the difference between PRK and trans PRK? So we must understand that both are surface ablation. The traditional PRK, we used to remove the epithelium either by mechanically debriding it or loosening the epithelium with alcohol and then removing it and then ablating the cornea. What we do in transepithelial PRK, trans PRK is one of the brands used by one of the companies, but we have TransLite from another company also. Essentially, all these technologies, what they are doing is they are using the laser to remove the epithelium instead of removing it mechanically. And the procedure is done as one step. There's no delay between the removal of epithelium and the performance of the ablation for the refractive correction. So because it is one step, it is faster and the epithelial defect size is slightly smaller. What you should notice in the video is when you're ablating the epithelium, the laser spots are visible in a different color, and when you start reaching the stroma, they change to red. So epithelium appears blue and the stroma appears red. So that's how you know that you have transitioned from the epithelium to the stroma. So this is just an animation showing you the same thing. As you can see on the cartoon on the left side, in traditional PRK, you would have to do first a PTK. If you were to do a true transepithelial PRK, but using a machine which didn't have that technology of one-step transepithelial PRK, you would first do a PTK and then you would have to do a PRK. So what you would end up doing is you would make a larger epithelial ablation, and it may most of those older machines would just give you one flat 50, 60 micron correction, which is same at the periphery as well as the center. Whereas the newer machines now are able to give you like a customized epithelial removal, which may be different in the center and the periphery, and the epithelial defect will match exactly the size of your ablation zone. So Smart Surface is one of the technologies which is present in the Schwind, which is the machine which I use. So it uses a patented technology called Smart Pulse, which gives you a very smooth bed after the surface ablation using some sort of software interventions. So why should one be doing a single step transepithelial ablation? It's a shorter procedure, smaller epithelial defect, faster epithelial healing. It's effective, gives you very comparable results with other refractive procedure, and avoids the need for epithelial scraping and alcohol usage. So it significantly hastens the procedure, and also has lesser complications because you're not using any mechanical debridement of the epithelium. So chances of recurrent erosions, etc., is much lesser. And one must remember that epithelium is the best masking agent. So if you have some irregularities on the surface, the epithelium is actually smoothing it out. When you remove the epithelium to perform an ablation, you're losing that advantage of epithelial smoothing. So it's always best to remove the epithelium with a laser. And of course, we all know the problems that other procedures have. And because you have no flap or interface, you are certainly avoiding all of these. Now, this was an interesting study, showed the epithelial healing and clinical outcomes with different types of surface ablation. And you can see that the transepithelial PRK certainly gave you a faster healing, and that thereby reducing the postoperative discomfort for the patient. So I told you about this two-step versus single step. Main advantages being the shorter duration, so lesser chance of desiccation also, because there is lesser chance of corneal desiccation. Your refractive outcome will be better. You will have lesser hyperopic shift. And because it's a smaller epithelial defect size, your healing will be faster. Patient will be more comfortable postoperatively. Epithelial thickness maps also are very useful now, which are available. So once you have the epithelial thickness map, you can actually custom plan your epithelial ablation in the newer platforms like the Schwind Amaris. So that is very useful because not every patient has a similar thickness of epithelium. Some may have about 40 microns, some might have 60 microns. So you can actually customize it, which really helps you to make your outcomes much better. Now, tissue wastage can occur if you end up removing too much. If you plan to remove 50 microns of epithelium, but actually the epithelium is only 40 microns thick. So that is something which you can certainly avoid if you have a epithelial thickness measurement using the OCT, which is now widely available. Optic zone planning is very critical when you're doing transepithelial PRK, especially if you have a small refractive error. It is recommended to go for a slightly larger refractive error, otherwise you'll end up with undercorrections. Surgical pearls, it's important. Main thing in transepithelial PRK is that the surface should be just the right amount of dry. It should not be too wet, otherwise you'll have undercorrections. If it's too dry, overcorrections, and if you have too dry, it can be overcorrected. If it's too wet, it'll be undercorrected. Topography guided ablations are certainly useful in specific indications, and I'll just touch upon them later. And Smart Pulse technology is one of the new software developments in Schwind, which actually gives you very good immediate postoperative visual improvement. So immediately on the first day, the surface is so smooth that the patient can even read 20/20 unaided. And that gives you the wow factor which you were earlier missing in surface ablation. So this is just a video to show how the laser color changes when you pass from epithelium to stroma, and of course mitomycin, etc. The rest of the steps remain the same. It also helps to reduce pain significantly. Many of these patients are much more comfortable than our traditional PRK patients were. And other measures one can use are chilled BSS and use of NSAIDs. I'm sure Dr. Gaurav will cover these in the next talk. This was an interesting study which showed that the transepithelial PRK performed much better on dryness, severity, soreness, sharp pains, stickiness. All these were much better off in the transepithelial versus the alcohol-assisted PRK. There are some studies from Europe which showed that even the haze is much lesser, and of course, mitomycin C helps to stretch the limits And people are even performing up to 10 diopters with surface ablation now without much haze because of the use of mitomycin C. So in addition to traditional indications, specific indications where transepithelial PRK I feel has a role is when you have an irregular cornea, be it from scar or a post-keratoplasty, post-refractive surgery, or even when you're doing a combined procedure like cross-linking in a patient with keratoconus. So I'll just quickly show you some cases. So this was one patient post-LASIK, had a small refractive error, and instead of relifting the flap and disturbing the interface, simple thing to do in most of the post-LASIK cases is to just do a surface ablation. Of course, you have to use mitomycin C whenever you're doing surface ablation on top of a LASIK flap, unlike traditional thinking where it was banned to do surface ablation. Now, many people are doing these with very good outcomes, and I think mitomycin C has made the difference. So this is just to show that patient had wonderful clear cornea. You can't even make out that anything has been done. Again, post-keratoplasty, fabulous results. You can see the topography changes beautifully. Main advantages with topography guided ablations, you can regularize the cornea, improve not just reduce the refractive error, but also improve the uncorrected and best corrected vision. And I have a long series of post-keratoplasty surface ablation, and all of them are doing so well. This is another patient who had a post-RK. You can see the refractive outcome is very good. And here we have actually managed to correct about 5.5 diopters. And you can see the change in the power difference map. This was just another interesting case I done recently. This was a patient who had a FALC for granular dystrophy, superficial granular dystrophy. You can see the best corrected vision after the FALC was very bad. Patient is 618, very unhappy with the distortions. And you can see the topography is so irregular. So we did a topography guided ablation in this patient and a custom ablation, as you can see. And patient did really well. You can see that the cornea topography has become very regular. The vision improved to 6/6 with a small refractive error. This is just another patient with a keratoconus. You can see bilateral keratoconus, typical epithelial thinning in the area of the cone, and you can see the decentered cone. And you can see after a combined cross-linking with topography guided ablation, patient actually got a fantastic result of 6/6 and N6 unaided in both eyes, which I wasn't planning for because I had undercorrected. But patient is extremely happy. And you can see even the epithelial thickness map shows a very uniform kind of surface, even though of course the pachymetric map shows the inferior thinning. So transepithelial PRK is here to stay. It is the actual true blade-free laser because you're not even touching the cornea. It's an all laser procedure. I think it has certainly helped in the resurrection of PRK. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Rishi. I think it was an excellent presentation, and certainly the surface ablation is making its waves back. But one thing which doesn't help the procedure, of course, is the pain, and that's why we have the next talk, which is going to be by Dr. Gaurav Luthra, the German ARC of IRSI and the past scientific committee member of AIOS. And he's going to speak to us about the pain-free PRK. Is it a myth or it is a reality? Over to you, Dr. Gaurav.
Thank you, Dr. Vardhaman, and thank you, BOA and MOS, for inviting me, and very interesting program today. So this is something which has been close to my heart last few years, working on making PRK painless. So, and Rishi has done a great job of telling us about the trans PRK, which has been one of the major things for making painless PRK possible, among other things. So we've seen how refractive surgery has evolved. So we've now reached a situation where we have several options available to us, and patient has a choice, surgeon has a choice, and no one thing fits all. So PRK procedures, we've gone from alcohol-assisted PRK to LASIK to epi-LASIK and then trans PRK, and now there is renewed interest because PRK seems to be superior in biomechanical stability and refractive stability as well compared to many other procedures, and from the point of view of safety. So the advantages we all know. I will not go into them because Rishi has already covered these different situations where PRK may be much better. And ectasia is extremely rare. I think that's one thing which really stands out for PRK compared to even SMILE and LASIK. But there are limitations, and discomfort is one of them. Longer period for visual recovery was thought to be one of the important things. We've tackled that quite a bit now. and haze, which has been really well managed with the use of mitomycin over the last 15-20 years, as Majmudar and Randy Epstein's work on that. And again, initial concerns on regression, which have now been taken care of with modern lasers. So the current status of PRK is that haze is extremely rarely seen now, and refractive stability has become excellent. But then what holds us back from doing more PRK? So pain, I think, is the thing, and most surgeons that I know who don't do PRK end up telling that patient discomfort is something which drives them away from PRK, and I thought I will address that. So pain can be of three types: inflammatory, nociceptive, or neuropathic. And there's been a lot of ways that we can manage pain in such situations. We've tried pharmacological interventions like opiates, comfort drops like topical anesthetics, which are very popular in the US, but in India, we tend to shy away from them. Topical NSAIDs have been used after refractive surgery, oral analgesics, oral bolus steroids, and then, of course, something which worked wonders for pain management when it came about for the first time, till the time that people used to be bandaged for first few days in both eyes, is the bandage contact lens, which happened almost 20 years back, but has been a remarkable improvement in PRK management. And then, of course, corneal cooling with chilled BSS, and even some people use ice packs. So ice packs have been used quite popularly in the US as well, and some people in India use them. But some studies say that there was almost no difference between using ice packs in reducing post-PRK pain. So we started using BCL soaked in AccuVale or ketorolac 0.4% almost about 3 years back after the initial studies. This has been tried before, but was enthusiastically taken up by Narayan Nitrale under Rohit Shetty's team. And I happened to visit for one of the meetings 3-4 years back and noticed this and came back and tried it, and it immediately worked wonders for us. And this was a publication from their group on pain management after PRK. Where they evaluated the role of 0.45% ketorolac soaked contact lens. And they concluded that it can work as a nice depot, which can reduce pain after transepithelial PRK or any kind of PRK for that matter. So our experience has been good, and we now use, because AccuVale became out of the market almost a year and a half back. So there was this new alternative which was available. I have no financial interest, but I did trials for this drug about 6 months back. Seems to work as well as AccuVale, which was from Allergan, and this is from I think yes, Endot, and it's worked quite well for us. It works almost similarly to AccuVale. We have about 50 odd patients tested on AccuSaid now, and we empty out the fluid from the blister pack of the contact lens, and then put in these few drops of AccuSaid, and then soak it for about 5 minutes. In Rohit Shetty's study, they had done it for almost 30 minutes, but we find that doing it even for 5 minutes is good enough and effective. And then once we have completed the ablation and done the mitomycin application and irrigation, we just put in this contact lens. It works wonders for the patients. And some of the other important steps which Rishi already mentioned, chilled BSS right after ablation, we use mitomycin. Now this has no relation to pain control, but I think mitomycin has really worked wonders for making PRK more reliable and effective and minimizing risk of haze. And then of course the bandage contact lens. I'm sorry. So we also, for those of us who don't have trans PRK on their machines, this is another great option. In fact, alcohol used to cause a lot of pain and discomfort and reaction to patients' eyes. We use the Amoils brush a bit, and I've been using it for about 10 years. I stopped using alcohol almost 10 years back. It's quite remarkable. And it takes off the epithelium very effortlessly, and the amount of reaction and pain and discomfort is much, much less compared to alcohol. There's a huge difference. And then to the next level, if you want to go to the trans PRK, that it goes to the next step. And we are using a lot of trans PRK now with almost about 130 eyes of trans PRK. So, however, as Rishi emphasized, trans PRK requires epithelium thickness mapping to be done to customize your surgery properly. And the post-op pain and healing is much faster, pain is much less, and patient's visual rehabilitation is much better. So this is again another step towards making painless PRK possible. Some patients, I'll be finishing in less than 30 seconds now.
खास वाटरिंग में भी पेन कितना होगा? अब क्लोज एंड शो द फेस also nearby. Some close and show the face because eyes के आसपास कोई swelling वगैरह कुछ नहीं है ना. And morning में उठ के आपको ठीक लग रहा था? Eyes आराम से खुल गए किसी रोज पे और लगातार ऐसा तो नहीं हो कि eyes के पास सामने?
Okay.
Second last thing बोलो.
So vision is almost 6/6 unaided or 6/9 day one. You cannot make out comparing to your SMILE or LASIK patients if which of them went PRK. Otherwise, you would have eyes lid edema and reaction and swelling. So they do quite well. This is the other post-op regime. We start topical steroids right after the surgery. Tell the patient to start it few hours after the surgery, and vitamin C and strict UV protection. I think this is the key for preventing haze. And topical steroids are the key for 6 to 8 weeks. So there are cautions when you use NSAIDs. You should be careful about possibility of SPK, and there've been reports of corneal melts, but not so much with ketorolac, and it may lead to delayed epithelial healing sometimes, which is very rare. So I think Rishi has covered epithelium mapping, so I will not delve on that, but I really trust epithelium mapping for all my refractive surgery, and we do follow-ups. So PRK, for many surgeons, it's just 5 to 10% of refractive procedures, and many surgeons don't perform PRK at all. But I think if pain is looked after, as we've shown, many surgeons will start doing PRK, more often. And Rishi has reached that level of 60-70%. For me, it is a little less, but I still do about 20% of my practice as PRK, and I think SMILE occupies a little bigger volume than that. And LASIK has really become a very, very small part of my practice. So I think with that, I'd like to stop.
Thank you very much. I think, Dr. Gaurav, it was a brilliant talk, and certainly both Ocucell and OptiSat both have really transformed the surface ablation practices for many of us. I would agree with all your points. Thank you again. And because of the lack of time, very quickly, I would like to request Dr. Partha sir, Dr. Maskati sir, and Dr. Nitin sir for very quick concluding remarks, and then we'll conclude the session. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Vardhaman. I think we have covered a very large number of topics in a very short while, and each of the topics had very good take-home points. And I think all of us have benefited rebrushing our strategies, as well as thinking about the newer strategies, the new equipment, which would add to the practice of refractive surgery. Thank you very much for having me in this program of yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Partha. And since Vardhaman, we are really running short of time, it will be unfair to the next session. Nitin and I will not speak any further, and we'll straight away hand over to the next. Ragini, over to you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much, sir. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Partha, sir. Thank you, Maskati, sir. Thank you, everyone. Be safe, be careful, and we pray for everybody. Thank you so much.